Well, here we are in All Saints' Tide, and it's thought that there's been more written about the gospel we just read today than any other accounts of the teachings of Jesus. And many think that the gospel we just heard is itself the greatest sermon ever. It's always set for the Sunday before or after All Saints' Day, which is of course celebrated on the 1st of November. And indeed, this teaching of Jesus spoken to a random crowd who followed him onto a mountainside early in his ministry is known as the Beatitudes, a litany of what it means to be blessed for living the Christian life in this world, with the promise of attaining a place in God's heavenly kingdom. So at this All Saints' Tide, how do we find meaning and relevance in the notion of sainthood and saintliness? And how does it apply to us? Ronald Knox, who was a Roman Catholic theologian, wrote this: "The church in heaven is all saints, but the church on earth is all sorts. There are all sorts of us in the Church of God, all sorts of denominations, all sorts of personalities, and we are all called to be saints of God. We, people of God, are all sorts of saints." This should assure us that the idealized idea of saints being perfect beings set on pedestals or depicted in beautiful stained glass windows is far from the true one, but it seems to have emerged from the early history of the Church. In the early centuries, Christian martyrs were remembered on the anniversary of their deaths. And in 3 centuries of persecution, many days were allocated to be their saint's name day. By the 4th century, the later and lesser saints became known collectively as the communion of saints, to be remembered on All Saints' Day on November the 1st. But later and lesser means that to be a saint, you don't have to be famous or a spiritual overachiever. Saints are people who follow the teachings and example of Jesus Christ. In other words, saints are you and me, all of us called to be saints of God, not born to be saints, but living and becoming saints, guided by the promises made at our baptism. And before us, it's those who've gone to glory before us, those we have loved. For some of us, our mothers and fathers, wives, husbands, sons, daughters, brothers, sisters, grandparents, aunts and uncles, and dear friends. All Saints' Tide is a sort of personal memorial day for us to celebrate all of them, though they're never far from us and always in our hearts. For Christians, this is important, because believing our dear ones live on in us is part of sainthood. One of the things that often grieves people when a loved one dies is worrying that in time they might forget what their loved one really looked like, or the sound of their voice. Grief at losing someone can truly make you feel you've gone mad. In time, though, we come to know that even in death, those loved ones are still very much alive within us. So today, we remember the faithful and beloved from every age who have lived the life of faith, and we celebrate the promise that we are on that journey ourselves, even if we wonder if we're really up to it. But even the greatest saints were real people. Just like us, even the famous ones who've been put on pedestals, they were simply sinners just like the rest of us. They struggled with sin and temptation. They've walked the journey towards holiness, sometimes stumbling, sometimes falling, but always getting back up and moving on in the pilgrimage of life, resolving to do better, to be better, to aim higher. We too might struggle through life's challenges and sadnesses, yet with God's help, we carry on. No one's born to be a saint. You have to become one. And Jesus' teaching in today's gospel calls us to be poor in spirit, to be meek, merciful, to make peace. This is how we become what Jesus called blessed and what the church calls saints. It's a tall order, but this All Saints Tide reminds us of our great potential, the promise that lies within each and every one of us, the promise of holiness fulfilled in the countless people known and loved, unknown and inspiring all the saints who've gone before us. They give us blessed hope that every one of us is in the communion of the saints of God. Amen.